At the center of Sakon Nakhon, within walking distance of the morning market and the provincial government offices, there's a Buddhist temple complex that has been in continuous use for over 500 years. The main stupa, a tall, white, Lao-style chedi that rises above the surrounding rooftops, has been the spiritual centerpiece of this community since the 15th century. Thai pilgrims have been walking toward it, making offerings at its base, and sitting in silence in its courtyard for longer than most nations in the world have existed. On a typical Tuesday morning, it is almost completely empty of visitors. Not because it is closed, not because it is difficult to find, simply because the town it stands in has not been placed on any international travel itinerary, and so the people who would most appreciate it have never been told it exists. This episode is about the sacred sites of Sakon Nakhon, what they are, what they mean, and why the experience of visiting them is fundamentally different from visiting a temple in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, or Ayutthaya. It begins with the stupa that has anchored this province for half a millennium. Wat Pratat Chong Chum sits on the western bank of Nong Han Lake, at the edge of the old town of Sakon Nakhon. The name translates approximately as the temple of the sacred relic at the place of many trees, a name that describes a landscape that has changed considerably over the centuries, but that still, in the early morning, carries something of the quality of a forest clearing. The temple's origins are bound up in the history of the region in a way that makes it impossible to understand the building without understanding something of the civilization that produced it. This part of northeast Thailand was, for several centuries before the modern era, the cultural and political territory of the Lao-speaking peoples of the Mekong River Valley, a civilization that predates the modern national borders of Thailand and Laos, and that produced a distinctive architectural tradition, a body of Buddhist scholarship, and a network of sacred sites that stretched across the entire upper Mekong basin. Wat Pratat Chong Chum was built within this tradition. The stupa, the tall, pointed, multi-tiered tower that dominates the temple compound, follows the Lao architectural style rather than the central Thai style. Where Bangkok's chedis tend toward the tall, sharply tapered forms of the Ayutthaya tradition, the stupa here is broader at the base, more graduated in its tiers, and topped with a gilded finial of a style more commonly seen across the Mekong in Laos than in the Thai heartland. It is, in a very literal architectural sense, a monument to a civilization that no longer exists as a political entity, but that left its mark across the entire northeast of the country. The specific relic that the temple is believed to enshrine, a footprint of the Buddha, according to local tradition, was the reason for the original construction and has been the reason for continuous pilgrimage ever since. The veneration of Buddha footprints is an ancient tradition within Theravada Buddhism, one that predates the construction of images in human form, and the footprint at Chong Chum is considered one of the most sacred in the Northeast. The temple has been rebuilt, expanded, and restored multiple times over its 5 centuries of existence. The current stupa dates in its present form to a major restoration in the 20th century, though earlier structures remain visible within the compound for those who know where to look. The decorative panels on the base of the stupa, the carved Naga serpents on the stairways, and the surrounding smaller shrines all carry different layers of history, some centuries older than others, accumulated in the way that active sacred sites accumulate, rather than being planned. Arriving at Wat Pratat Chong Chum in the early morning, before 8 o'clock, the first thing that becomes apparent is the quality of the silence. The compound covers several hectares, enclosed by a low whitewashed wall that separates the sacred space from the surrounding town. Inside that wall, the noise of the city, the motorbikes, the market sounds, the daily business of a provincial capital, diminishes to something distant and unimportant. The compound has old trees, their root systems spreading across the stone-paved paths in the way that tree roots do in places that have not been landscaped or managed for tourism. There are smaller shrines placed around the main stupa, some of them maintaining the incense and offerings of recent visitors, some of them older and less attended. The reflection pond in front of the main stupa is still in the early morning. The stupa and its gilded spire are mirrored in the water with a clarity that, at the right hour of day, makes it difficult to determine where the actual structure ends and its reflection begins. This is not an accidental feature of the design. The alignment of the stupa, the pond, and the eastern horizon is deliberate, a piece of sacred geography that places the sunrise and the reflection in a specific relationship that would have been understood by the people who designed it as meaningful. Thai Buddhist pilgrims visit Wat Pratat Chung Chum throughout the year, but the temple draws particularly large numbers during the major Buddhist festivals, the Sakabucha, Asanhabucha, and especially Ok Pansa, the end of the rains retreat, which is the occasion for the lake festival that the following episode in this series will cover in full. On festival days, the compound fills with worshippers who have traveled from across the province and from further afield. Offerings of flowers, incense, and gold leaf are brought. The monks who live in the adjacent monastery conduct ceremonies. The atmosphere is one of genuine religious practice rather than cultural performance, a distinction that is immediately apparent to anyone who has experienced both. On ordinary days, the compound is quiet. A few local residents come in the morning to make offerings before work. The monks move between the monastery buildings and the main temple. The stupa stands in the light and the silence, exactly as it has stood for 500 years. To understand the sacred geography of Sakon Nakhon fully, it is necessary to understand a second tradition, one that is less ancient than the stupa, but that has had a greater influence on the living practice of Buddhism across the world. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a monk named Ajahn Mun Bodhisattva began a movement within Thai Buddhism that would eventually reshape the way the tradition is practiced in Thailand, in the West, and across much of the Theravada Buddhist world. Ajahn Mun, as he is known, rejected the increasingly settled and institutionalized character of mainstream Thai Buddhism and returned to a practice rooted in forest dwelling, strict observance of the original monastic code, and intensive meditation. He spent decades wandering the forests of Thailand, Laos, and Burma, living in remote wilderness areas, training a generation of students who would carry his approach into the 20th century and beyond. The final years of his life were spent in the forests of Sakon Nakhon province. He died here in 1949 at the monastery of Wat Pa Sutawat on the edge of the provincial capital, and the monastery remains an active place of pilgrimage for Thai Buddhists, particularly for the monks and lay practitioners of the forest tradition, who consider Ajahn Mun the most important teacher in their lineage. The influence of what Ajahn Mun began in these forests extends far beyond Thailand. His direct students established the international network of monasteries that has brought Theravada Buddhism to the West. The monasteries in England, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand that have introduced hundreds of thousands of Western practitioners to the tradition. The abbot of Amaravati Buddhist monastery in England, one of the most significant Buddhist institutions in the Western world, traces his lineage directly to Ajahn Mun through the teachers he studied with in these forests. Wat Pa Sutawat itself is a modest place by the standards of famous Thai temples. There is no grand architectural statement, no tourist infrastructure, no English language signage. The monastery is active, monks live and practice here, and visitors are received with the quiet, unhurried courtesy that characterizes forest tradition monasteries everywhere. The kuti, the small individual dwelling places where monks live and meditate, are set among trees at a respectful distance from one another. The atmosphere is one of serious practice. The room where Ajahn Mun died is preserved within the monastery. His relics and some of his personal effects are kept here, and the room is a place of pilgrimage for Thai Buddhists who understand the significance of what this teacher represented. For a visitor who comes knowing this history, standing in that room carries a weight that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss. Beyond Wat Pa Sutawat, the forests and hills of Sakon Nakhon province contain a number of forest monasteries, Wat Pa, as they are known in Thai, that continue the tradition Ajahn Mun established. These are not tourist destinations. They are not on any map produced for visitors. They exist for one purpose: the practice of Buddhist meditation in natural surroundings, and they operate according to rhythms and rules that have nothing to do with the tourist economy of the province. The largest and most significant is Wat Pa Bon Tad, a forest monastery in the hills southwest of the city that was established by one of Ajahn Mun's senior students and that remains an active training ground for monks. The forest around the monastery has been protected for decades by the monastery's presence. The trees that would otherwise have been cleared for agriculture still stand because the monks who live among them have a religious motivation to maintain them. Visiting a forest monastery in Sakon Nakhon requires a degree of preparation and sensitivity that visiting a mainstream tourist temple does not. Modest dress is not merely expected, but essential. Silence within the monastery grounds is the norm rather than the exception. Photography is generally not appropriate within the inner precincts. The monks are not available as guides or interpreters. They are there to practice, and a respectful visitor understands that their presence is the visitor's privilege, rather than the monastery's obligation. What a prepared and respectful visitor encounters in these monasteries is something that is extremely rare in contemporary travel, a place that is entirely indifferent to being visited. The forest monastery does not perform for observers. The monks walking their meditation paths in the pre-dawn dark are doing so because it is their practice, not because it is someone's itinerary. The silence of the forest at 5 a.m, when the only sounds are the birds beginning their dawn chorus and the occasional bell signaling the start of a period of communal practice, belongs to the place rather than to any visitor. This quality, of a place that exists for its own reasons, is what distinguishes the sacred sites of Sakon Nakhon from the sacred sites of Thailand's well-touristed regions. At Wat Pho or Doi Suthep, the temple is real and the religious practice is genuine, but the infrastructure of tourism has inevitably shaped the experience of visiting. The guided tours, the entrance fees, the souvenir stalls, the crowd management systems, all of these are necessary responses to scale, but they change the encounter. In Sakon Nakhon's forest monasteries, none of this exists. The encounter is unmediated. Approximately 5 kilometers north of the city center, a second major sacred site sits in a setting that is even quieter than Wat Pratat Chongchum. Wat Pratat Narai Chengwang is a Khmer period temple, older in its origins than the Lao-style stupa at Chungchum, built during the period when the Khmer Empire's cultural influence extended across the upper Mekong basin. The laterite stone structure, characteristic of Khmer religious architecture, has been standing here for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years. Unlike the great Khmer temples of Phnom Rung and Pimai further south, Narai Chengwang has not been extensively restored or developed for visitors. The structure retains much of its original character, including the weathering and partial deterioration that centuries of tropical climate produce. Ancient trees have established themselves within and around the stone walls. Roots move through the masonry in the slow, patient way that vegetation reclaims abandoned architecture over centuries. The temple is named for Narai, the Thai rendering of the Hindu deity Vishnu, and the carved stone lintels that survive above the doorways carry images drawn from Hindu mythology. This is not unusual for Khmer religious architecture, which drew on both Hindu and Buddhist iconography in a synthesis that reflected the complex religious life of the Khmer court. By the time Buddhism became the dominant practice in this region, The temples built in the Khmer tradition had already been absorbed into the local Buddhist landscape, their original dedicatory purpose overlaid by centuries of Buddhist use. Standing at Narai Chang Wang on an ordinary morning, the only sounds are the birds in the trees that have grown through the temple walls and the distant sound of a motorbike on the road outside. There are no other visitors. There is no ticketing booth, no information board, no parking area for tour buses. The temple simply sits in its field, 1,000 years old, completely accessible, entirely overlooked. Visiting the sacred sites of Sakon Nakhon, requires a different approach from the kind of temple tourism that the better-known parts of Thailand have developed infrastructure to support. The most important practical point is timing. The temples and monasteries of this province are at their best in the early morning, between 5:30 and 8, when the light is extraordinary, the heat has not yet arrived, and the sites belong to the monks and the local worshippers rather than to anyone else. Arriving at Wat Phra Tat Chong Chum at 6 in the morning, when the mist is still on the lake and the golden hour light is catching the gilded spire of the stupa, is a fundamentally different experience from arriving at 10 when the sun is overhead and the compound has lost its quality of stillness. Dress requirements at all of these sites are the same as at any Thai Buddhist temple: shoulders covered, legs covered to at least the knee, shoes removed before entering any building or any area adjacent to the main stupa. These requirements are not negotiable and are observed by local visitors as a matter of course rather than as a rule that needs to be enforced. At the forest monasteries, the additional expectation of silence within the grounds should be understood before arriving. Conversations should be kept to a minimum and conducted quietly. Mobile phones should be on silent. The monasteries are places of practice, and the presence of a visitor who understands this is welcomed. The presence of a visitor who treats the monastery as a sightseeing attraction is not. All of the sites described in this episode are free to enter. There are no entrance fees, no compulsory donations, no infrastructure of any kind designed to extract money from visitors. The modest offering of fresh flowers, incense, and a small monetary donation placed in one of the donation boxes within the temple compound is the appropriate expression of respect for a visitor who wishes to make one. But it is entirely voluntary and should never be made in a way that draws attention to itself. The total distance between Wat Phra Tat Choing Chum in the city center, Wat Pa Sutawat on the edge of the city, and Wat Phra Tat Narai Chang Wang, 5 kilometers to the north, is manageable in a single morning on a hired motorcycle or in a songtao. The 3 sites together represent the full range of the province's sacred heritage: Lao-style Buddhist architecture, the living forest tradition, and the ancient Khmer substrate that underlies the religious history of the entire Northeast. There is a question that the sacred sites of Sakon Nakhon implicitly ask of the visitor, and it is worth considering directly. Why does it matter that these places are empty? Why is the absence of other foreign visitors part of what makes them worth visiting, rather than simply an incidental condition that might change at any time? The answer has to do with what temples and monasteries actually are, as distinct from what they are commonly treated as in the context of tourism. A temple is not a monument. It is not an artifact preserved for observation. It is a living institution, a place where a community organizes its relationship with the sacred, where the rituals of birth, ordination, death, and seasonal celebration are conducted, where the monks who serve that community live and practice. The building is the shell of this life, not the life itself. When a temple is placed on a major tourist circuit, the living institution and the monument begin to separate. The monks move to less accessible areas. The ceremonies become, at least partly, performances. The silence is broken by the management of visitors. The building remains, but the quality of the encounter changes. At Wat Pratat Chongchum, this has not happened. The temple is a living institution in the complete sense. The monks are there. The ceremonies are conducted for the community, not for observers. The silence of the early morning belongs to the place, rather than being manufactured for visitor experience. This is what the emptiness of Sakon Nakhon's sacred sites actually means. It is not an absence of something that should be there. It is the presence of something that tourism at scale tends to displace. The sacred sites covered in this episode, Wat Pratat Chongchum, Wat Pa Sutawat, and Wat Pratat Narai Chengwang, represent the spiritual architecture of a province that has been practicing Buddhism continuously for over 1,000 years. They are accessible, free, unhurried, and almost entirely unknown to the international travel community. For a visitor who comes prepared and comes early, they offer an encounter with living religious practice that is increasingly difficult to find in the parts of Thailand that have been developed for tourism. The next episode turns to water. Nong Han, the Great Lake at the heart of this province, is the setting for one of the most visually extraordinary events in the Thai calendar. Every October, at the end of the Buddhist Rains Retreat, the people of Sakon Nakhon gather at the lake's edge and send illuminated boats across the water in a ceremony that has been conducted here, in this form, for longer than anyone can reliably record. That episode covers the lake in all its moods: the dawn fishing, the red lotus season, the ordinary life that plays out on its shores through the year, and it ends on the night of Okpanza, when the water becomes something that needs to be seen to be fully understood. That episode is next week. If this series is showing you a side of Thailand you did not know existed, subscribe to Travel Savvy Thailand. Every week goes deeper into Sakon Nakhon and the hidden corners of Isaan. This is Travel Savvy Thailand. New episodes every week. If you have visited Sakon Nakhon, or if there is a sacred site in Thailand that you believe deserves more attention than it receives, leave a comment below. Everyone gets a reply.